The princess believed her human husband was weak. Until even the gods submitted to him. The ship docked with a sound like the universe clearing its throat. I heard it through the wall of the transit pod. A low, resonant groan that moved through metal and bone and settled somewhere behind my teeth. Outside the porthole, the station was the size of a small moon, carved from a rock that had probably existed before my planet learned to grow. Trees. Lights ran along its surface in long curving lines like veins or like warnings. My name is Owen Calloway. I am 32 years old. I have a torn ligament in my left knee that never healed right. A slight allergy to a particular type of Veilthari pollen that nobody warned me about. And as of 6 hours ago, I am the husband of the 7th princess of the Veilthari Imperium. I want to be clear about something. I did not volunteer for this. I was selected. There is a difference, and I think about that difference often. A committee of 12 people who will never set foot on this station reviewed 47 candidates from across the human diplomatic corps, and at the end of 3 months of interviews, psychological evaluations, language testing, and one very uncomfortable physical examination, they chose me. When they told me, I asked what specifically had put me above the other 46 candidates. The lead evaluator, a woman named Dr. Patricia Wren, who always smelled faintly of burnt coffee, looked at her notes and said, "You have an unusually high tolerance for silence. And you don't panic." That was it. That was why I was standing in a transit pod on the edge of the known galaxy, wearing a suit that had been made by a Veilthari tailor, who had never measured a human body before and had done his best. The treaty was simple on paper. Humanity had made first contact with the Veilthari Imperium 11 months earlier. The Veilthari were not hostile, which was good. They were also not impressed, which was less good. They operated on a system of alliances sealed through personal bonds, marriages, partnerships, oaths of blood and name. They had done this for 3,000 years. It worked for them. If humanity wanted access to Veilthari trade lanes, Veilthari medical technology, and most importantly, Veilthari protection against the 14 other civilizations who had already noticed us and were not nearly as restrained, then humanity needed to offer something personal. Something, as the treaty document put it, of flesh and sincerity. The committee chose me. I picked up my bag, which contained 3 changes of clothes, 2 notebooks, a mechanical pencil, a photograph of my sister and her dog, and a thermos of coffee that I had filled just before boarding because I had read the Veilthari did not have anything like it. And I had decided that was one comfort I was keeping. The pod door opened. The corridor beyond was enormous. Everything about the station was enormous, which made sense because the Veilthari themselves were enormous. The shortest one I had seen in briefing photographs stood about 7 feet tall. The royal family was taller. The walls of the corridor were a deep dark blue, lit from below by a strip of soft gold light, and the ceiling arched so high above me that it seemed to belong to a different room entirely. My footsteps echoed in a way that made me sound like one person pretending to be a crowd. 2 guards stood at the far end of the corridor. They wore armor that appeared to be grown rather than built. It followed the curves of their bodies like a second skin, dark and iridescent, shifting color very slightly when the light caught it. They were each roughly 8 feet tall. They looked at me the way you might look at a package that had arrived at the wrong address. Between them stood a man in plain clothing, a human man, which surprised me enough that I stopped walking. He was perhaps 50, with a trim gray beard and the particular kind of calm face that only exists on people who have spent a long time around things that frighten them and come out the other side. He nodded at me. "Owen Calloway," he said. "Not a question. That's me. I'm Clive Barrow, cultural attaché. I've been stationed here for 8 months. I'll be your interpreter for the first few weeks, until your Veilthari is functional." He glanced at the thermos in my hand. "You brought coffee?" I did. "They'll think it's medicine." "Then I'll let them think that," I said. He almost smiled. "Follow me." The throne room was not a room. It was a space. A vast open space at the center of the station opened to a transparent dome through which the gas giant below rotated in slow, enormous patience. The colors of it bled upward through the glass, orange, gold, deep bruised purple. It was genuinely one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen, and I gave myself exactly 3 seconds to appreciate it before I put my face back into neutral and focused on the platform ahead of me. The Emperor was there. The Imperial Court was there. Approximately 300 Veilthari nobles stood in formal arrangement, and they were all looking at me with expressions that ranged from politely curious to openly skeptical. A few were talking quietly to each other behind long fingers, which I assumed was the Veilthari equivalent of whispering at a wedding about how the groom seems nervous. I was not nervous. I want to be clear about that too. I was focused, which looks similar from the outside but feels very different on the inside. The Emperor spoke. Clive translated softly at my shoulder, formal words of greeting and binding, the language of treaties 3,000 years old. I listened carefully to the original sounds even as Clive gave me the meaning. I had been studying Veilthari for 9 months. I was not fluent, but I was further along than anyone knew, including Clive. Then she stepped forward and the court went quiet. Her name was Siraine Velvayak, 7th Princess of the Imperium, 3rd in succession to the seat of eternal governance, and she was the most striking person I had ever stood in a room with. She was nearly 8.5 feet tall, with the long, tapered build of all Veilthari royalty, and her skin was the pale blue silver of deep ocean water caught in moonlight. Her eyes were very dark, nearly black, with a faint ring of gold at the outer edge. She wore no crown. She did not need one. She looked at me for a long time, not with cruelty, with assessment. The way a very skilled engineer looks at a structure she has been told will hold weight and is not yet sure she believes it. Then she said something. Her voice was low and clear, the kind that carried without effort. Clive translated. She says, "Welcome to the Imperium, and she hopes your journey was comfortable." That was not what she said. I had caught enough of it to know. What she had actually said was closer to, "Welcome. I hope you are as durable as they claim, because this court will test everything you have." I looked at her and nodded slowly. I said nothing. I simply held eye contact for a moment, not aggressively, not submissively, just steadily. And then I looked at the Emperor and gave a formal bow as I had been trained to do. Behind me, I heard one of the nobles say something. Laughter rippled through the nearest cluster of them. Clive did not translate it, which told me it was probably something about my size. I had been 5 feet 10 inches my entire adult life. In this room, I was the shortest person present by about 2 feet. My suit fit well enough. My coffee was getting cold. The ceremony finished. I was shown to my quarters, a suite of rooms that were large even by Veilthari standards, which meant they were almost comically oversized for me. The bed was the length of a boat. The chair at the writing desk required a small step to climb into. Someone had placed a single arrangement of flowers on the windowsill, pale and spiked, native to a world I had never heard of. I looked at them for a moment, then sat on the floor, which was at a comfortable height, and opened my thermos and drank my coffee. It was still warm, just barely. That night I started writing in my first notebook. I wrote the date, the name of the station, and then, "She does not expect me to last." I can see it in the way she looked at me, not with malice, but with the calm certainty of someone who has already calculated the outcome. She has lived 3,000 years. To her, I am a season, maybe less. I understand that. I am not offended by it, but I notice things. I have always noticed things quietly, without making a display of it, and I have a feeling that this court is full of things worth noticing. I closed the notebook. Outside the dome window, the gas giant turned and turned, enormous and indifferent, as it had been doing long before I was born and would go on doing long after I was gone. That was fine. I was here now. I was present. I finished my coffee, set the thermos on the floor beside me, and went to sleep. The court had a rhythm. Once I understood that, everything became easier. The Veilthari nobility woke before the station's artificial dawn and spent the first 2 hours of every morning in what they called the reflection hour, a period of meditation and formal thought that was deeply private and not to be interrupted. After that came the breakfast hall, which was a large, open room where approximately 40 nobles gathered each morning, and the conversation never fully stopped. Then came the petition hours, when the emperor or his appointed stewards heard requests and disputes from the lower citizens of the station. Then came the afternoon functions, meetings, training, court business. Then a private dinner for the royal family, which I was invited to as Siraine's husband, and which I attended every evening for the first 2 weeks, without anyone speaking to me directly except to pass food. I learned a great deal in those 2 weeks by saying almost nothing. I learned that the noble families were divided into 3 loose alliances, and that the tension between them was very old and very carefully managed by the emperor through a system of calculated marriages and strategic favors. I learned that the head engineer of the station, a tall Veilthari man named Varric, had been trying to fix a water filtration problem in the lower servant quarters for 4 months, and had been denied the parts he needed because a rival noble family controlled the supply depot. I learned that the head archivist, an older woman named Sorath, who had the calm, precise manner of someone who had been reading for centuries and found most conversations a slight waste of time, was the most quietly powerful person in the court, after the emperor himself, because she controlled access to every treaty, every record, every piece of history the Imperium had. And I learned that a general named Draven, who had a long scar across one side of his face and moved through the court like a rock through water, slowly and absolutely unstoppably, had been watching me since my first day with an expression I could not quite read. I also learned that Siraine woke at least an hour before the reflection hour began, alone, and walked the outer ring corridor of the station in silence. I know this because on my 7th morning, I could not sleep, and I went for a walk, and I found her there. She stopped when she saw me. I stopped too. We were in a corridor where the outer wall was entirely transparent, and the gas giant filled the view from floor to ceiling, its massive storms turning in beautiful, slow catastrophe. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I said, in Veilthari, imperfect but clear, I did not mean to interrupt, I will walk the other direction. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, slowly, as if reconsidering something, you speak our language. A little, I said. I am still learning. You have been studying since before you arrived. Since 9 months before I arrived, I said. She looked at me for a long time. I had already noticed that the Veilthari were very comfortable with long silences in a way that most humans found difficult. I was not most humans. I looked back at her and waited. Walk with me, she said finally. We walked the corridor together, and she did not speak again for almost 10 minutes, and I did not push. When she did speak, she asked me what I thought of the station. I told her the truth, that it was extraordinary, that the engineering involved in carving living quarters and governance halls out of a moon, while keeping structural integrity across that surface area was something human engineering had not achieved yet, and that I had been trying to understand how the heat distribution systems worked because they were unlike anything in my briefing materials. She looked at me sideways. You notice the heat distribution. I notice most things, I said. She said nothing else for the rest of the walk, but she did not send me away either. That was the first morning. After that, without either of us ever formally agreeing to it, I walked with her most mornings. We said little. Sometimes I brought a second cup. I had found a container that worked well enough and offered it to her. On the third morning, she accepted it. She held it for a while, smelling it before she tasted it. I watched her face carefully. It was not an expression I could name exactly. It was not dislike. It was something more like the face a person makes when they encounter something that refuses to fit into any category they already have. She drank it all. She never asked what it was. The problem with Varek's water filtration system was not complicated. It required 3 specific components and about 6 hours of technical work. The components were held by Lord Cassin's family supply depot, and Lord Cassin had been blocking Varek because Varek had given testimony 3 years earlier that supported a ruling against one of Cassin's trade agreements. It was petty. It was the kind of petty that only functions in systems where power is distributed unevenly, and everyone knows the rules are flexible for the right people. I spent 4 days understanding it fully. Then I had a conversation with Sorath the archivist, because I had been visiting the archive every day, and she had begun to acknowledge me with something other than careful blankness. I asked her, very politely, whether there was historical precedent for the station commander. Not the emperor, but the appointed station commander. Requisitioning supply depot materials for structural maintenance under emergency repair codes. Sorath looked at me for a very long moment. Then she pulled a document from a shelf without looking, placed it in front of me, and said, Page 43. Page 43 contained exactly the precedent I needed. Varek had his components within 48 hours. The filtration system was repaired in the servant quarters before the end of the week. Nobody traced it back to me directly. The servant staff, none of whom had spoken to me before, began leaving small offerings outside my door. Not food, but small carved objects. A tradition I had read about that among the Veilthari lower class, something close to, you are considered a person of good faith. I kept all of them. I lined them up on the windowsill next to the flowers. The poisoning happened at the 42nd evening dinner. I did not know it was happening at the time. The food was served in small courses, communal bowls placed at the center of long tables, and I ate carefully because some Veilthari ingredients did not agree with human digestion, and I had learned to identify the ones that affected me. What I did not know was that one of the broths in the 4th course had been altered, not with anything native to Veilthari cuisine, but with a synthesized compound specifically designed to affect biological systems with human-range oxygen metabolism. Someone had done their research. That frankly concerned me more than the poisoning itself. I felt it 2 hours later, a deep, heavy heat moving through my chest and into my arms. I sat in my room and thought about it carefully. The symptoms matched a class of compounds that were not immediately fatal to humans, but were designed to be debilitating. Fever, disorientation, weakness in the muscles. Designed, I suspected, for someone who would call for help, make a scene, and be found incapacitated by the court. Designed to make me look fragile. I decided I was not going to make a scene. I spent the next 3 days in a controlled state of deliberate function. I drank water. I ate plain food. I slept in long intervals. I monitored my own symptoms with the methodical calm of someone who has had to be their own doctor in situations where panic would make everything worse. By the morning of the 3rd day, the heat had receded to something manageable. By the morning of the 4th day, I felt merely tired, the way you feel after a very long run rather than after an illness. I attended the council briefing on the fourth morning. I sat in my usual place. I drank from my thermos. I listened to 3 hours of administrative proceedings with complete attention. Serene found out by accident that evening. One of the kitchen staff had been questioned as part of a routine review, and the detail about the altered broth came to the surface. And she came to my rooms at an hour when the station was quiet, and she stood in the doorway and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. "You were given a systemic toxin," she said. "Yes, 4 days ago. Yes, you did not report it." I thought about how to answer that honestly. I did not want to create a situation that required managing. The compound was not lethal at the concentration I received. I calculated I could manage it without assistance. I did not want to pull you into it when you have a court to run and a war council meeting scheduled, and 2 noble families who are currently testing each other's patience over the water depot situation. She stared at me. It was a long, still stare, the kind that is not blank but is moving very fast behind the surface. "Why did you not want me to carry it?" she said finally. It came out less like a question and more like she was reading aloud something she had just written. "Because it was my problem," I said. "You did not poison me. Someone in your court did. Making it yours to solve would have meant you spending political capital on my behalf when we are 4 months into this arrangement and that capital is better spent elsewhere." She sat down. Not on the chair. She sat down on the wide ledge of the window, the way she had never done before in this room, informally, without ceremony. She looked out at the gas giant. "You are a strange person, Owen Calloway," she said. "I have been told that," I said. She was quiet for a while. Then, "I will find out who did it." "I know," I said. "I already know who did it. I have been watching Lord Cassin's household for 2 weeks. I have 3 pieces of evidence. When you are ready to act on it, I will give them to you." Another long silence. "You were ill," she said, "and you were still gathering evidence." I had time on my hands. She looked at me then, and for the first time since I had arrived, the assessment in her eyes was something different. Not softness, not yet, but the careful look of someone who has just realized that the calculation they made at the beginning was missing a variable. An important one. That was the moment, I think, though I would not have named it then. The moment the ground shifted very slightly, under both of us. I had also, in those 4 days, made 2 more allies. Draven the general had come by on the second day with a direct, unannounced knock at my door. When I opened it, he looked me up and down once, said in very blunt Vaelthari, "You are still standing," turned around, and left. By Vaelthari military standards, I had later learned from Sarath, that was essentially a declaration of respect. And the young girl, the Emperor's grandniece, a child named Lyra, who was perhaps 9 years old by human reckoning, and had the enormous, curious eyes and limitless energy of every 9-year-old in the universe regardless of species, had been trailing me for 2 weeks at a distance, watching me write in my notebook from around corners. I had known she was there from the first day. On the 8th day I sat down in the corridor where she usually watched from, opened my notebook to a blank page, and without looking up said in careful Vaelthari, "Would you like to learn a knot?" She came out from around the corner so fast I almost dropped my pencil. I taught her the bowline, the cleat hitch, and a figure 8, using a length of cord I had brought in my bag because I had found, over years of field work and travel and long, uncertain waits in places where things might go wrong, that something to do with your hands was always worth having. She was an extraordinarily fast learner. She told me with complete seriousness that none of the adults in the palace had time to show her things like this. I told her I had plenty of time. She came back the next day and the day after that. Sorath watched from the far end of the corridor once and said nothing, but I saw the corner of her mouth move. Serene saw it too, on a morning when Lyra was showing her newly learned knots to a palace guard, who was doing his patient best to look interested. Serene stood beside me and watched, and I did not say anything, and after a moment she said, very quietly, almost to herself, "She has not had someone to sit with her in a long time." "She is good at knots," I said. "She will be good at most things, I think. She just needs time." Serene did not respond, but that evening at dinner, for the first time, she introduced me to the nobles at the table by my full name in the words that, in Vaelthari formal address, meant husband in the truest sense of the word rather than the treaty-bound designation they had been using. It was a small shift, almost invisible, but I noticed it because I notice most things. I wrote in my notebook that night, "She is beginning to see me, not as what I represent or what the treaty requires, just as what I am. That is enough for now. That is more than I expected at this point." In the margin I wrote something else, smaller. "She drinks the coffee without making a face anymore. She might even like it." I counted that as a win. The War Council was not supposed to include me. That was clear from the way the chamber doors were closed before I arrived, and from the way the 2 guards outside them looked at me with the particular blankness of people who have been specifically briefed on what to do if A human showed up. I waited in the corridor for 7 minutes. Then I said in Vealthari, to the guard on the left, a tall man named Orith who I had spoken to several times in the past month, and who had 3 weeks earlier accepted a cup of coffee and admitted it was not unpleasant. Orith, who specifically gave the instruction that I was not to be admitted. Orith looked at the ceiling for a moment, which I had learned meant a Vealthari was trying to decide how to answer a question they found inconvenient. The instruction was issued by Lord Casson, he said finally, in the general preparatory orders. Lord Casson, who was currently under quiet investigation for the poisoning, who controlled a supply depot, and who had decided to insert himself into War Council administration. Excellent. Was there specific imperial decree excluding members of the royal household? I asked. Another ceiling consultation. No thank you, I said. I opened the door. The room went very quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected enters. The War Council was arranged around a long curved table, approximately 20 senior military officers, 4 noble lords and Serain, who was seated to the right of the Emperor's chair, which was empty because the Emperor was unwell that week and had delegated proceedings. She looked at me with an expression that was, I was relatively confident, exactly 50% alarm and 50% something else that was not quite surprise. Draven, at the far end of the table, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. His expression did not change. Lord Casson, seated near the center, rose to his feet and said something rapid and formal that I caught enough of to understand was essentially, this is a restricted session. The human has no standing here, remove him. I sat down in the empty chair at the foot of the table. My name is Owen Calloway, I said in Vealthari, slowly enough to be clear, carefully enough to be correct. I am a member of the royal household. I have no vote. I will not speak unless invited. But I would like to observe. Nobody removed me. Casson looked at Serain. Serain looked at me. I looked at the table and waited. The session continued. What I heard over the next 4 hours was a military crisis of the First Order. The Dren Collective, an empire that shared a contested border with the Vealthari across 6-star systems, had launched a multi-point offensive 3 weeks earlier. The Vealthari had responded with their traditional approach, overwhelming concentrated force at key strategic positions, the same approach that had won them wars for 2 millennia. It had not worked. The Dren were not fighting the way they had fought before. They were dispersed, fast, striking at logistics and supply lines rather than engaging in direct confrontation, pulling back before superior Vealthari forces could close the distance. In 3 weeks, the Dren had not won a single direct engagement. They had also never lost one. The Vealthari had won every direct engagement and were losing the war. The council argued in circles for most of the session. They had solutions that were variations of their existing strategy: more force at more points, faster response times, heavier weapons. None of it addressed the actual problem, which was that the Dren were not playing the same game. I wrote in my notebook while they talked. Not notes about the meeting. I was writing something else. At the end of the session, as people began to rise, Serain said something that made the room stop. What she said was, the human has been writing. I would like to know what he wrote. I looked up. The room was looking at me. I considered my options for exactly 2 seconds. Then I stood, which in this room meant I was still shorter than almost everyone seated, and I said, I have been writing a tactical outline based on something my ancestors called asymmetric response doctrine. It is not a new idea for humans. We have been using versions of it for several thousand years, primarily in situations where a smaller or less conventionally powerful force needed to fight a larger, better equipped one. The core idea is to stop trying to win direct engagements and start targeting the opponent's ability to sustain them, supply lines, communication morale, not the drain ships, the things that keep the drain ships in the field. Silence, General Draven said, still not moving from his relaxed position. Go on. I went on. I spoke for approximately 40 minutes, which I could tell was testing the patience of several of the nobles, but which Draven and 2 of the senior military officers listened to with absolute stillness. I was careful, I was precise. I knew what I knew and said it plainly, and where I was guessing I said I was guessing, and I used 3 specific historical examples from human history where this approach had worked, and 3 where it had failed and why. When I finished, Lord Casson said with controlled disdain that this was a theoretical exercise from a species that had not yet achieved interstellar capability on its own and whose military experience was limited to a single planet's history. That is accurate, I said. A single planet where we have been fighting each other continuously for approximately 12,000 years. We have made every possible mistake in warfare. We know most of them well enough to avoid them, which is a different kind of education than winning easily. Draven made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The council did not adopt my proposal that day. That was expected. It was too new, too different, too much from the wrong source. I had expected to plant the idea and let it sit. The first offensive after the council failed. The second failed more badly. The third was a catastrophe that cost 3 Veil-Thari warships and came very close to breaching a colony world's orbital defense. On the morning after the third failure, Serene came to my rooms before the reflection hour. She sat on the window ledge, her usual spot now, and she was quiet for a long time before she said, "I want to read your full tactical notes." I gave her the notebook. She read for 2 hours. I drank coffee and looked out the window and did not interrupt her. When she finished, she set the notebook down carefully and said, "This will work." "I believe so," I said. "The execution details need adjustment for Veil-Thari capability and the specific geography of the contested systems, but the framework holds." "You thought of this while being poisoned," she said. She said it not as an accusation but as a statement of fact she was still processing. "I had time on my hands," I said again. She looked at me with the expression she had been using more and more over the past weeks, the one I had, still not fully named but which was warm in a way her court face never was. "Will you come to the council tomorrow?" she said. "Not to observe, to present," I said. The fourth offensive used a modified version of my framework adapted by Draven and 2 of his senior officers, which was honestly better than my original. It worked the way good strategies work, not all at once, and not without cost, but decisively and in a direction that could not be reversed. The Dren supply lines were disrupted. Their communication nodes were taken off active use one by one over 11 days. Their dispersed forces, which had been effective precisely because they were fast and disconnected, became a liability when they could no longer resupply or coordinate. On the 14th day, the Dren Collective requested ceasefire terms. The council chamber filled with a sound I had never heard from a Veil-Thari. Gathering before, not formal celebration, not controlled applause, but something deeper. A sound that had relief in it, and exhaustion, and genuine joy. Draven caught my eye from across the room. He gave a single slow nod. I nodded back. Serene, standing near the front of the room, said nothing, but she turned and looked at me across the chamber, and she did not look away. That evening, a Dren diplomatic vessel transmitted their first formal communication to the Veil-Thari command station. The message requested a meeting to begin ceasefire negotiations. Specifically, and this is the part I wrote in my notebook that night in large, careful letters. Specifically, they requested to negotiate with a human. The small one, their communication read, as translated by the station's system. "The one whose thinking is like something that has survived its own end and carries that knowledge with it. We do not wish to fight that kind of thinking again. We wish to understand it instead." I read the message twice, then I wrote in my notebook. I did not see that coming, I should have. And then, because I believed in being honest with myself, this has gotten considerably larger than I planned for. The summons arrived on a morning when I was teaching Lyra an extended version of a sailor's, not that I had been saving for when she was ready. It came not by the usual station communication system, but through a channel that Sorath later told me had not been used in 400 years. The message was delivered by a messenger who wore clothing I had never seen before. Not Veil-Thari, court dress, not military uniform, something older and plainer and far more formal than either, in a color that did not have a name in any language I had yet learned. The messenger gave the scroll to Serene, bowed once to both of us equally, and left without another word. Serene read it. Then she sat down slowly, which was something I had very rarely seen her do without intention. "What is it?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The Undying Architects have called a conclave." I knew what the architects were. I had read about them in Sorath's archives over long evenings with a cup of cooling coffee and a notebook full of questions. They were not gods in the way most human religions meant the word. They did not claim creation or supernatural origin. They were simply very, very old. Beings who had existed since before the Veil-Thari Imperium, who had shaped parts of the galaxy in ways that were difficult to distinguish from what most species would call miracles, who had written the foundational laws that underpinned every galactic civilization's legal framework, and who gathered, perhaps once in 300 years, to address something they considered significant enough to require their collective attention. "What is the conclave for?" I asked. She looked at the scroll again. Then she said very carefully, "They wish to determine the legal standing of humanity in galactic civilization, whether you are to be recognized as a full civilization under the Charter of the Living, or reclassified." "Reclassified," I repeated. "It is a legal term. It means," she paused, "it means removed from the protections of the Charter. It would apply to your entire species." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "When?" 11 days. I wrote in my notebook that night for a long time. Not strategy, not observations. I wrote about what was at stake, not abstractly, but specifically. 12 billion people, every city, every child, every cup of coffee ever made, every argument ever had over something trivial. Every person who had ever looked up at the night sky and felt something that had no name for it. 12 billion people whose legal existence in the wider universe was going to be argued in a room full of beings so old they had watched stars form. And I was going to be the one in the room with them, I wrote. I am not afraid. I want to be precise about that. It is not that I think this is manageable. It may not be. It is that fear would not help anything right now, and I have work to do. At the bottom of the page I wrote, I am going to need more coffee. The conclave chamber was not on the station. It was on a ship, a vessel that had no visible means of propulsion, and whose hull was made of something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, so that in open space it was visible only as a shape where stars were not. It appeared alongside the station 2 days before the conclave, and stayed there without communication until the morning of the event, when a single door opened in its side and a slow platform extended. Serene and I traveled across together. I was in the best suit I owned, which was still obviously a human suit in a room that had never contained a human. She wore formal court dress, deep blue, precise, no ornamentation. She had tried to brief me on architect protocol 4 times over the previous 11 days. I had listened and taken notes and also quietly done my own research through every archive text Sorath could locate. The chamber inside the ship was not as large as I had expected. It was perhaps the size of a modest concert hall, with curved walls that seemed to have been grown rather than built, and a floor that was completely transparent, showing the open stars beneath. 7 chairs stood in a loose arc at the center of the room. In them sat the architects. I had read descriptions. The descriptions were not adequate. They were tall, taller even than Veilthari, and their bodies had the quality of things that had been shaped by time rather than by any simple biology. Their faces were recognizable as faces in the way that very old sculptures recognizable as human, the proportions correct, but simplified by age into something more fundamental. They looked at me with eyes that were simply dark and deep, and full of a patience that was not passive but enormous. The patience of things that are not in a hurry, because they have learned that everything arrives eventually. Serene moved to stand in the place assigned to the royal court, and I stood beside her, and the eldest architect, the one in the center chair, who was fractionally larger and fractionally more still than the others, looked at me in a way that I can only describe as looking through time. We know of you, Owen Calloway, it said. Its voice was not loud, but it filled the room completely, the way deep water fills a space. We have been watching your species since before it had fire. I said nothing. I was there to listen first. The architects spoke. They spoke for a long time, methodically, in the formal language of the charter, and Serene translated what she could at low volume while I followed most of it myself. Their argument was not hostile. That was important to understand. They were not enemies of humanity. They were presenting a legal and philosophical case with the detachment of beings who had made similar cases about many civilizations over many centuries, and their case was, in its way, rigorous. Humans were anomalous, short-lived in a galaxy that measured significance in millennia, biologically fragile in a universe full of species who had long since solved most of their own vulnerabilities, historically chaotic. Our record of internal conflict was, they noted, the longest and most varied of any civilization that had survived contact. We had no ancient ruins, no record of prior galactic engagement, no presence in any of the foundational treaties. By the metrics the Charter used to define a civilization worthy of full legal protection, we were ambiguous at best, and then I was asked if I wished to speak. I stood. I looked at the eldest architect, and I thought about Patricia Wren and her comment about silence, and I thought about Serene in the early morning corridor, and Lyra learning knots, and Varroc's filtration system, and 3 days of quiet illness that I had carried without making it anyone else's problem, and a war council that had not wanted me in the room and had ended up using my ideas to stop a war. And I thought about 12 billion people who did not know this room existed but who were in it anyway, carried here by everything they had ever done and built and survived. I took a breath. You are correct about everything you said, I began. Every measurement you cited is accurate. We are short-lived. We are fragile. Our history is full of choices that should have ended us a dozen times. You are right about all of it. I paused. But I would ask you to consider something. You measure a civilization by its permanence, by how long it lasts, how stable it grows, how deeply it roots itself in the structure of things. That is a reasonable standard. It is the standard of beings who have time. I looked around at all 7 of them. We do not have time. We have never had time. Every human who has ever lived has known, from the moment they were old enough to understand it, that they are here briefly, that they will be gone. And what we have done with that knowledge is not to despair, and not to surrender, and not to wait for the long arcs of history to carry us somewhere safe. We have built. We have learned. We have argued with each other, which I understand is not a recommendation. But what comes out of those arguments is adaptation. faster than anything I have observed in any other civilization. We change because we have no choice not to. We improve because there is no time for anything else. I let that sit for a moment. I am the first human in this room. I did not come here as a warrior or a diplomat or an emperor. I came here because a political treaty needed a person to stand in a court that expected nothing from him, and I was chosen because I am quiet and I do not panic. In the time I have been in this Imperium, I helped stop a slow infrastructure failure in the servant quarters that would have become a serious problem within 2 more seasons. I contributed to ending a war that was going badly. I have been building relationships with the people in this court, one honest conversation at a time. None of that is grand. None of it is the stuff of ancient records. I looked at the eldest architect directly. But it is what we do. Not because someone told us to. Not because it serves an imperial agenda. Because we are brief, and we do not want to waste the time we have on smallness. You asked whether humanity deserves recognition under the Charter of the Living. I would ask you to consider not whether we have been here long enough, but what we have done with the time we had. The chamber was entirely silent for a long time. Then, from behind me, I heard a sound, a quiet movement, the controlled precision of formal court dress. I turned. Serene was standing. She had risen from her seat without announcement, without precedent, without any protocol that covered this moment. And she was standing straight and still with the full force of 3,000 years of dignity behind her. I stand with my husband's testimony, she said, in a room that had not raised its voice in centuries. That sentence landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went in every direction. Draven, who had been permitted to attend as military commander, and who I had not seen since entering the chamber, also rose. He said nothing. He simply stood. Sorath, representing the archive, rose from her place. Varek, who should not technically have been present at all but had apparently managed to find a reason, rose from near the back wall, and Lyra, small 9 years old, standing beside the Veiltheri court attendants, rose on her toes and stood as straight as she could. The eldest architect looked at all of them. Then it looked at me. It rose from its chair. The remaining 6 rose with it. The eldest said, in a voice that was quieter than before, almost private, "We have been wrong before, not often, but when we have been wrong, it has been precisely in cases like this one. When we measured something by the standards designed for a different kind of thing, and missed what the thing actually was." It paused. "We will consider the full record. But I will tell you now, Owen Calloway of humanity, your species will not be reclassified. You are recognized under the Charter, full standing." The room exhaled, not loudly. It was not a room for loud things, but the exhale was real, and it was mine as much as anyone's. Then the eldest said, and there was something in its voice that I had not expected. Something lighter, almost curious. "There is a matter of a position. A seat on the conclave has been unoccupied for some centuries. We find ourselves considering, for the first time in our history, offering it to a mortal." Every eye in the room went to me. I thought about it. I thought about it genuinely for about 4 seconds, with the full weight of what it meant. A seat among the beings who wrote the laws the galaxy lived by. Influence on decisions that would shape civilizations for the next several centuries. The first human voice at the highest table that existed. "I am honored," I said, genuinely, more than I have words for in any language I know. I paused, but no, thank you. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. "You decline," the eldest said. "I decline," I confirmed. "I am here because I am married, and my wife's court needed some help, and I had useful skills. I am not a representative of humanity's ambitions. I am one person, doing one person's worth of work. A seat on the conclave would mean becoming something else, and I do not think I would be good at something else. What I am good at is being in a room, paying attention, and helping with a specific problem in front of me." The eldest architect looked at me for a very long time. Then something happened that Sorath later told me she had found no record of in 400 years of conclave history. The eldest architect laughed. It was not a large sound. It was quiet, brief, and entirely genuine. The others joined it, one by one, and the sound filled the room in an unexpected way, warm and unguarded. The laughter of beings who had been surprised by something and were genuinely glad to have been. "Then we wish you well, Owen Calloway," the eldest said, "with your one person's worth of work. We suspect it is worth more than it sounds." The garden on the outer ring of the station was not famous for anything. It was not the kind of place that appeared in formal records or received official attention. It was a small stretch of cultivated ground where someone had planted things that grew in the station's artificial light and that did not belong to any single world's catalog, collected specimens from a dozen systems, planted without strict order, allowed to grow into each other and become something new. I liked it because nobody important ever came there. I was sitting on the ground with my back against a wall that was warm from the heat systems below, my notebook open on my knee, my thermos beside me, writing the last entry of my third notebook since arriving on the station. I had been in the Veilthari Imperium for just over a year. My Veilthari was now fluent, which I was proud of. My knee still hurt on cold mornings, which I was less proud of but had accepted. The photograph of my sister and her dog had been joined on my windowsill by 23 small carved objects from the servant staff, 2 drawings from Lyra, a small written note from Draven that said, in blunt and abbreviated Veilthari military script, something that translated roughly as, "You are unexpectedly acceptable," and a single pressed flower from a world I had never visited, left without any note or identification, which I suspected was from Sorath, because it was a type described in a text she had specifically handed me. 6 months earlier, I was writing, "The Conclave recognized humanity under the Charter of the Living. That means 12 billion people have legal standing in galactic civilization. I will not pretend I fully understand what that means in practical terms yet. I suspect it will become clear over time. What I know is that it is not nothing. It is in fact the furthest thing from nothing." I heard footsteps behind me and did not look up. The footsteps stopped. Then Serene sat down, not on a bench, not on the wall ledge. She sat down on the ground, beside me, in her full formal court dress, with complete unconcerned dignity, as though sitting on the floor of a small garden was something she did every day. I looked up from my notebook. She was looking straight ahead, at the nearest cluster of plants, where something purple and insistently growing was curling up around something that had arrived from elsewhere and was beginning to curl back. "What are you writing?" she asked. "The story of a man who came to the stars as a joke," I said, and somehow forgot to leave. She was quiet for a moment. "Is it a good story?" I thought about it. "I think so. It gets better toward the end." She looked at me then. In the year I had been here, I had become better at reading her face. Not because she had become easier to read, but because I had become more careful about looking. What I saw now was familiar, the warmth that lived under the court composure, the careful and private nature of a person who had been formal for so long that informality required courage. But there was something else, something that had been building slowly over 12 months of morning walks and shared coffee, and difficult councils, and one very important room with 7 ancient chairs in it. She reached out and took my hand, not my arm, not my wrist, my hand, the full thing, her long fingers wrapping around mine in the deliberate, decided way of someone who has thought about doing something for a long time and has finally stopped talking themselves out of it. I did not say anything for a while. Then I said, "You reached first." "I know," she said. "You have never reached first." "I know," she said again. She looked back at the plants. "I have been thinking about something you wrote. Before the conclave, when you were still being assessed. I wrote a lot of things before the conclave. This one was in your second notebook. I found it when you left it on the table in my study." She paused. "You said that some things hold the universe together, precisely because they bend." I remembered writing that. It had been a late night, and I had been thinking about materials science, which was how I often thought about people. "I have been thinking about it since," she said. "About what it means to bend without breaking. I thought for a long time that I understood strength. I have lived 3,000 years. I have governed, negotiated, and fought. I thought I understood what held things together." She paused. "And then you arrived. And you were poisoned and said nothing. And you walked into a council room where you were not wanted and sat down quietly. And you ended a war from a notebook. And you went to the architects and turned down the most powerful position in the galaxy, because it was not the right fit for the specific problem in front of you." She turned to look at me. "I did not understand you for a long time," she said. "I measured you by my standards and found you small. I was wrong. You are not small. You are the strangest and most precise and most quietly determined person I have ever met in 3,000 years of meeting people. And I have been." She paused, and what crossed her face was the closest I had ever seen her come to shy. "I have been glad you are here. For some time. I should have said it sooner." I looked at her for a moment. Then I turned back to look at the plants, the way she had been looking at them, side by side, looking at the same quiet thing. "You take your coffee without sugar now," I said. "You didn't like it for the first 2 weeks and you never said anything." "It grew on me," she said. "Most good things do," I said. She was quiet for a while. Her hand was still in mine. I thought about Patricia Wren and the 47 candidates and the selection committee. I thought about the ship docking with a sound like the universe clearing its throat, and the corridor like a different country, and the first morning walk when neither of us had anything to say but stayed anyway. I thought about Lyra's knots and Sorath's archive and Draven's single nod, and a war ended with a notebook, and a room full of ancient laughter, and 12 billion people who would never know their future had been argued for, in a chamber where the stars were visible through the floor. I thought about being chosen because I was quiet, and I did not panic. I opened my notebook. In the last empty space at the bottom of the page I wrote, "I am still just one person." I have a bad knee and a thermos that needs replacing, and a wife who has lived 1,000 times longer than I will. None of the math adds up to anything that should have worked. But I have learned this year that the things worth keeping are not always the things that are built to last. Sometimes they are just the things that show up and keep showing up and refuse to be defined by anyone else's calculation of what they should be. I thought about putting the notebook away. Instead, I wrote one more line. She asked me once what humans fear most. I told her being forgotten. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Then I will remember you. Long after the stars that watched your birth have gone cold, I will remember you." I closed the notebook. The gas giant turned below the station, slow and enormous and patient, as it had been doing long before either of us arrived, and would go on doing long after we were done. I was fine with that. I had never needed the universe to notice me. I only ever needed to be present in the part of it I was standing in, to pay attention, to help with the specific problem in front of me. Serene's hand was warm in mine. The garden around us was a collection of things from different worlds that had grown into each other and become something new. I had absolutely nothing left to say. That was, in its own way, the best feeling I had ever had.